Dhirubhai,
Hi.
I'm so glad to be here with you.
Same here, Boa.
That's
Pleasure.
wonderful that we, after the first project in which we were together, reinventing social emancipation when we came to Coimbra 2001, and here we are again, and we have been together in many other occasions. But I really am so happy to be back in conversation with you. And this time we are in your land.
Yeah.
Where are we, Dhirubhai? This is Gujarat, that's your land. Tell me.
Look, we are at a very important and lovely place. We are at on the banks of river Sabarmati. That's precisely where, little downstream, Gandhiji, when he came from Africa, founded his ashram here, made a home, sort of. And it's downstream, just about 2 kilometers or so.
That's wonderful. And this, you know, evoking Gandhi in a sense, and before even we talk about Gandhi, everything that comes to our mind is the specificities of India as a colonial territory of the British Empire, coming from thousands of years of civilization and culture, and all of a sudden under a foreign rule, and trying to claim its own specificities in cultural, scientific, epistemological terms. And I think that thinking about these first moments, and for instance, one of the things that impressed me most many years ago was reading In Swaraj, because I came here for the centenary of that book. And since I was at the time already, you know, restless about epistemological issues, as you know, trying to reinvent social theory, to renew social theory, because I start from the assumption that the Eurocentric models of social theory that in fact were created in a few 5 countries at the end of the 19th century, in France, in Italy, in Germany, in the UK, and also in the United States. These theories don't account for the diversity and richness of the world today, of the experiences of the people, and of the social and political innovation taking place. And I was, you know, Gandhi in a sense at the time helped me to see the need for what you call the quest for endogeneity. And you have been in your work, particularly on the questions of state, on questions of the nation, you have been claiming that social sciences, and particularly social theory in India and political theory, should really be addressing more the realities and the roots of the Indian cultures. And I say in plural because there are several cultures, not just one Indian culture. And that, you know, not following in a naive way these more Eurocentric models. As we walk into this new millennium in which the crisis of the world with, you know, this neoliberalism, in a sense, globalizing the world, but at the same time fragmenting the resistance against this global capital, in which the social theories, in fact, have a very uncertain future. This is probably the time for us to discuss what kind of energies, what kind of resources we have, intellectual, cultural, epistemological, in different parts of the world, to renew theory and therefore to renew practice. And being in India and being here in Gujarat, I think that we are in the right place to think about these things. So the first thing I'd like you to talk with me, and our conversation focusing on these questions of the future of the social sciences here, coming from this experience. How do you see the need of this?
Look, there are 2 levels of the problem, I think, on which I would like to react to your comments, which is that first is social science everywhere. The way in which it has grown and sort of spread and explored many areas of lives in one comparative as well as specificity of a particular social scientific knowledge. And at that level, I think social science has grown, expanded, has even acquired degree of depth in one way or the other. But there is one problem which has always bothered me about social science in general, which is that it becomes its own sort of goal and process. It doesn't address two real issues. And I think the problem is basically epistemic, which is that people have criticized social knowledge more in imperial and that sort of things, but I think it has its, the theorization is of such an order that it becomes almost an alienated knowledge in one way or the other. When it grew, for example, the French revolutions and the other kind of movement that going out in the world and telling people and finding out what is wrong and how it should be corrected, and that romanticism of knowledge, as well as that continuous connectivity of knowledge and problems has been sort of lost in one way or the other, and it has become more reified, more not just theoretical. I think theory is always good. It is an abstraction which helps to unpack and reassemble and address to issues. But this is too much reified kind of a knowledge that it has grown almost universally, but about which I am talking of social science in a pursuit through disciplines of social science. I am not talking of social knowledge in general, which is a different order of things and knowledge where people contribute to it, they preserve it, they interact. But I am talking of generally what you may call the university system of knowledge and of disciplines. And they become more and more reified and alienated, and becomes a kind of self-appeasing process of acquiring knowledge. But this is general, about which I am not too competent and well-read to comment on the world of social science everywhere, but you know some reports have also come of the state of social knowledge and all that. But we are in India or in South Asia, generally we have a double predicament, which is that this knowledge came to us along with coloniality. So we, in India, the connection of knowledge with reality, with life, and with even continuities through which knowledge was cultivated and grown in India and South Asia has been totally lost. First with the language. I think you cannot have a language of social science which is not your own, and basically. I won't say English is not, it is, some people have been grown, but that was the first disconnect with the life and all that. I think the Portuguese social science even may be more rooted than Indian social science or a German, because your language, your life and reality all kind of are harnessed in producing knowledge, and that production process is, whether one likes it or not, or for whatever purpose, is linked to use, is linked to further kind of thing. Here, I think it's not like that. It is more reified, it is more alien, and there is great deal of disconnect between this sort of thing. So what we get are attributions in name of social knowledge. What is state? So what is caste? What is this? It is not we really see, experience and deal with. It is an attributed category which is being expanded all the time and applied. So it almost becomes, after a point, a very peculiar kind of knowledge. It could, I think it's almost metaphysical, though it is supposed to be non-metaphysical, empirical and all that, but when I talk of, it negates experience also of people, which is social experience. So this has to do more with our modern knowledge came with colonial power and exercised through the use of language a big disconnect between the knowledge people were grappling with, working with and inherited, and the knowledge that came. And it came with all its other values, perspectives and worldviews. So this is how I look at it.
And Dhirubhai, just a question for people, because this video will be viewed around the world for many people that probably are not so familiar with realities in India. And since in many countries in which we are working, in fact, the colonial language is not the language of the people, and many people don't speak. Is there an estimate how many people, the percentage of the population today in India, that speaks fluently English, even if they don't use every day? Is there any, or broken English, or broken, I don't know what that is.
There is a census and there are figures which I cannot quickly reproduce, but I think about 10%.
10%?
I mean, you can equate with the people who are university graduates for that kind of English. If you want to have Patio English, the bazaar English, it is a wider thing then because of tourism and this sort of thing. But language as a reality to live with, that language is, that knowledge is not spreading. So what happens is that people, it's not knowledge in fact. The knowledge is what you really internalize and work with. Those categories become your own way of looking at things, at life and into it. So there is a bar here for that, the knowledge that comes through English. And it is the knowledge that comes through English is the knowledge which is used even in democracy as a ruling categories also. I mean, just not language, but the categories are ruling. We'll talk about it if we talk of democracy, but liberalism is a dogma of democracy, a fundamental dogma. People understand democracy more as freedoms of different kind. So this mismatch is continuous between the knowledge system and therefore the ruling system of India and the living system of people. And this is a great predicament, I suppose, which knowledge puts in.
I think it's very well. I feel the same. This double disconnect, I would say. And one is this knowledge that is alienated and is alienating, so to say, because in fact the social theory, when it was developed in the mid-19th century onwards in Europe and North America, in fact it was trying to address concrete problems of that society at that time. And at that time, most of the world were colonies, and they were unknown, and they were not part of the conversation. And therefore, we cannot even blame these theories that they don't account for these realities because they didn't know them. They were trying to solve other problems. What happened then was, in fact, that these theories got universalized in this way, falsely in my view, because they became the lenses through which you can see the world, which is very diverse and therefore is not accounted for correctly in the same ways. And I think language is one of the aspects, and also cultures and so on. So the first disconnect, in fact, is within social scientific knowledge, the university-based knowledge, as you say, that is, as this disconnect, and we have to unpack the possibilities of creation within this field of knowledge. The other, I think, the other second disconnect that you were also addressing at the beginning is the disconnect between this social scientific knowledge, even if it becomes more endogenous in India, with the popular knowledges of the peasants' knowledge, the tribal people's knowledge, the urban movements' knowledges, that in fact this is the way by which people, run their lives. They don't run their lives by scientific knowledge, most of the people in the world. And I think this second aspect...
Let me interrupt you. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
You see, all knowledge, good knowledge, true knowledge, do connect. They need not have this sort of divide of the kind which has been created. I think the divide is created not because that knowledge, generally you can say, which is for rule, the language of ruling, order, all, and that divide, and the people's knowledge. This is not a necessary and permanent divide. I think there can be societies, and there probably were societies, and one can imagine of societies where this knowledge divide, which is where language is one important factor, but the other factor is whose knowledge,
Right.
for whom, for what.
That's right.
These issues have become too mundane, I suppose, and are too lowbrow to raise even in the high system of knowledge. But the question is that the overall knowledge which has come with the disconnect is working, but working to the purposes of rule, subjugation, order, elite formations of different kind, so that they have pushed the vast humanity into what you may call peoplehood.
That's right.
They have made people out of citizens or whatever you call. So people are always they.
That's right. Yeah.
In this knowledge system, people are always they, for whom you care, from whom you feel, from whom you want to rule, subjugate, extract, accumulate your capital. Different things are done by a knowledge system which is alien to these people.
Of course.
They have a knowledge system. And this disconnect was not always there. For example, in India, there was a very reigning kind of philosophy of Advaita, which means non-duality and something
right.
like this. Now this knowledge, through the categories of knowledge, spread through Bhakti movement. And the people's knowledge and the other knowledge, there is some disconnect and hierarchy, but was not, I mean, that was sort of corrected and used. So one hopes that through democracies, this knowledge divide will be bridged. But this democracy also has reached its own
That's right.
limits and all that.
I
It
don't
is
know
not
if
reaching.
we'll-
So the point I am trying to make is that knowledge ought got to be democratized.
I'm sorry. This is hurting. Yeah.
So our issues that we are
Yeah.
going to come back to it is that the democrat. I mean, we have not really thought of practices and programs and language. I'm not talking of language in terms of Portuguese or Gujarati, but the language carries. How this knowledge system, which is almost coagulated power system, need and ought to be democratized. And most revolutionary processes all over the world have emerged from democratization of knowledge. French Revolution is a known example, and how people had the encyclopedic movements and other kind of thing. But all this happens to that. I think Bhakti movement was like that in one way or other, and it brought its own revolution in India, bringing people into things. So I would like to frame in this project, or however, this issue of democratizing knowledge and freeing it from power system into a more wider democratic, participative kind of thing. See, we were together in social forum elsewhere, we always talked about learning from the people.
That's right. That's what
Now, what is that learning from the people, and who are these people, where are they?
That's right. Yeah, no,
But they are always there.
They are
And that's
always
my
there.
problem.
That's right. They are always
Even
there.
if we are for the people, they are there. So, and this has to do with the knowledge process.
I
Because
fully agree with you. I mean, this idea of the democratization of knowledge, and probably go step by step. For instance, here in India, there are two developments which I'd like to have your opinion about. One is, well, there were attempts in de-alienating knowledge, for instance, from the subaltern studies. Subaltern studies were a first attempt. I don't know if it were the first attempt, but was probably.
But it was unique, it's its own kind, different.
That's right. Well, how do you evaluate? It has been criticized recently from many different currents and so on. How do you evaluate this impulse for the subaltern studies?
Look, one has to critique the critics also, because one has to understand what are the terms and traits
Right.
perceived in criticism.
Yeah.
Like if we will talk about our party, that is the kind of thing. So most of the criticism of subaltern is one from which it has bifurcated or dissented, and that is the Marxist
Right.
view of knowledge. So there is a lot of Marxist criticism, whatever little I have followed, directly or indirectly, of subaltern. And second, discipline of history. Because first time subaltern makes history interdisciplinary in one way or the other.
Yeah.
It makes history as experienced, suppressed, and lived by people which was not seen as subject of history.
Absolutely.
So these are there. That doesn't mean that all of subaltern is like with everyone plays. Subaltern also has 2-3 movements, post-structural, subaltern and all that.
That's
it's
right.
there. But on the whole, I think it is a step in the discipline of history towards the direction of making knowledge, at least bringing democratic subjects into
the conversation.
Of knowledge.
I agree with you. I mean, that's my impression also. Of course, we are still here within the field of social sciences, bringing in still and the Western traditions, but in fact revising the whole history from the subaltern.
That's why I consider subaltern as the unique Indian. Because Indian, according to me, have a predicament of making contribution in social science because the two disconnect we talk of.
Yeah.
I think a devastated mind. Coloniality, I wish India was defeated on military all round and then resisting, but this was total kind of devastation of your universe of mind.
Yeah.
So we could only turn out second-rate copy of Western social science.
Yeah.
Given that sort of predicament. But subaltern, I think, is something which has broken this limits in one way or the other. I mean, that's what I.
But then a second issue that I think we should be addressing here is that once you take this idea of the subaltern, and we'll come back to that as the questions of the nation, who is the subaltern in India? And the subaltern in India is also a complex package because there are oppressors and subalterns within the subaltern India. And one recent development in the questions of knowledge and social scientific knowledge has been the quest for an epistemology and therefore a creation and validation of knowledge from the perspective of the Dalits, for instance. One colleague of ours, Gopal Guru, has written extensively on that, and in a book called Cracked Mirror, for instance, a dialogue with the philosopher Sarukai here. It's very interesting in the sense that Gopal makes the point that in India, the Dalits have been object of social theory, even of Indian social theory, but they have not been able to create their own social theory. So, and he says that there is a very intimate relationship between experience and theory and ethics. And therefore, this experience of the Dalits, when seen from the outside, always come in a wrong perspective, which raises an issue which I'd like to, which I address it to myself and I address to you, and I'll be discussing that with Gopal, is that then do you have to be a Dalit in order to, create a theory that is adequate to the Dalits' concerns and aspirations, or can we, out of solidarity and sympathy and whatever, and particularly participating in their own struggles, try to transcend this fact that a point is very well raised, that the Dalits themselves, as he says, they write poetry and novels and so on, but theory, it's not, they don't. The upper castes write the theory about them. Well, how do you see this issue?
I think this is very interesting. I've followed Gopal's work. We have, in fact, interacted a lot on different issues, and I respect what he has brought on board. in social science discourse. 2 points about it. One, I think, is Gopal's objection, and which is correct, that is the division of labor. Ultimately, the modern knowledge system ends up into division of labor. We do theory, you collect data, and that's all. We will acknowledge you for your assistance in building the database, but not for the research, not for the theoretical insight.
Right.
Now, this was the relationship between the Western social science and Indian university-based social science pursuits in the 50s, 60s, and the 70s, where the Gopal's observation and objections in the 50s, 60s, and 70s were raised by Indian social scientists vis-a-vis Western social scientists. So that Dalit syndrome sort of was there among all Indian social scientists who were trying to sort of negotiate the wider world of global knowledge, if you like, where because of post-colonial, from colonial to post-colonial, the relationship in social science was between Dalit and upper caste kind of projection, between the Western social scientists and the Indian social scientists. Now, the Indian social science has come of some kind of a, if not age, a prominence, and is recognized, like subalterns and through other things, others. This was done, looking back, this Dalit social science was done by upper caste in India in the global context. Now Gopal is right in pointing out that now that Dalits have come into the knowledge system as producers and creators of knowledge, they are subjectively also not encouraged to do theory. They are supposed to talk of their own problems, and we give theory and we become a global kind of a thing. So this is a well taken objection, but it is a process of in the knowledge power structure where this division of labor always becomes hierarchical. And it is truly hierarchical, what Gopal has pointed out, which has to be broken through. And which, that's why I treat it as an aspect of democratization of knowledge and freeing it from the clutches of power system. And in that sense, the second point, which is very important, Gopal has raised, can only Dalit address Dalit issues? I think we have to understand diversity also in the knowledge system. There is, I think, Gandhi tried his best to understand Dalits, and that was not enough. When Ambedkar came, it became very clear why that was not enough. I think there is indissoluble self and its experience, which only that self can bring on board. This is not a narrow idea of identity I am talking about.
Right.
If you are an European, and supposing if you are in a certain vantage point, and you wanted to be understood by non-European and particularly South Asian, there will come a point that you have understood me a lot, but something is missing, which you cannot. You cannot understand, at least a French I can say, I don't know about Portuguese, that they cannot understand community at all. And super Indians cannot understand French individuality, which is extreme in terms of secularism to life and everything. So there is an irreducibility which should be brought in the knowledge system as a diverse. I mean, you cannot have one universal knowledge system.
Absolutely.
And in that sense, I will pursue Gopal's argument of being Dalit as an irreducibility which experience has to contribute to the general knowledge system.
That's right. Yeah,
and that applies not only to Dalit.
Absolutely.
I think it may apply to any, but Dalit more so because of the history of oppression, which is absolutely, what should I say, dehumanizing. It's worse than an ordinary kind of subjugation. It's dehumanizing experience.
Absolutely.
And that struggle to save that humanity in the assault of dehumanization is something only Dalit can bring on the board. I mean, that is right. But therefore, I would not accept as a Dalit, you cannot talk of my problem and this. That's too simplistic.
Yeah, and I think that probably the way to overcome these irreducible moments that come out of that experience.
Reducible, dissolvable.
That's right.
And what you may call more sharing.
That's right.
That should be the aim of knowledge.
Yeah.
Knowledge should dissolve indissolubility, but must recognize indissolubility.
Absolutely. And the only way of doing that in my work, at least in my work, what I've been trying is that probably these differences they should not be eliminated, because they cannot in fact be eliminated, but we can talk between them through what I call intercultural translation. So if I recognize that my experience does not allow me to understand fully some other experience, at least I know that my own experience also is in the same position, and therefore we could probably transcend these differences without ghettoizing, without essentializing. You know, feminists here, only women can talk about women issues, only indigenous people can talk about indigenous issues or theorize about them. I think that we have to understand that there are different kinds of knowledge is produced here, but in a sense this experience, whenever, I think the ideal thing would be, but that's the ideal world, that this experience would come of age as theoretical knowledge, as knowledge that is respected, you know, beyond the community, beyond the tribe, beyond the caste, and at the same time would be open to some kind of intercultural translation, relations with others, without closing itself into, you know, the ghetto of that identity. So identities that are a bit more open, but they have to be constructed. And that's, you mentioned go ahead.
This is very well said, and I'm in agreement with you on that. But this is a tricky business. So one has to be tricky in the sense that you can reject a proposition that indissolubilities can be permanent. They never are. They break down, and new formations and sedimentations occur. So these are not permanent identities divided in different prison houses. No, whether it is Dalit or European or Brahmin, whoever they are. But at the same time, when you say, but that's the tricky aspect of it, when you say you are talking as if nobody can understand woman as a woman or Dalit as a Dalit. And there must be a space, and that, which is true, but these statements are often made in the context of power. So those who deny indissolubility and diversity, indissolubilities in diversity, often, not as a conspiracy, not consciously, but it's a position of power, aligned with knowledge. And the power of knowledge also, which is already established. It is on that basis you say, I can understand Dalit, which you can. But on that basis, you cannot make a proposal and a program for the Dalits, which Dalits do not want.
That's right, of course.
And why they do not want. Same about women. So we are in that sort of a phase of a knowledge system that despite democracy, knowledge and power are yet in coagulated state of one kind or the other. If that breaks and if the trust generates and the knowledge, then it comes into the normal process. Formations and dissolutions. That's how I would like to see in the Indian philosophical context. They form and dissolve, according to this sort of thing. And particularize.
No, absolutely. I think that you're right. And if we take the argument a bit further, first of all, I mean, all these claims to knowledge coming from populations, classes, communities, castes, whatever, races, whatever that means, but people with a different ethnic background that were discriminated against, they were oppressed and so on. All these claims now are part also of a political struggle for political resources, for economic resources, and therefore we have to understand these claims to knowledge as part of a much broader claim to society and to culture and to resources.
It's a claim to redefine selfhood.
That's right.
Of people, and selfhood is not redefined unless you make that knowledge your own knowledge.
Absolutely.
See, the crucial fact is that knowledge is still talked in terms of abstraction. It becomes my knowledge only I internalize it.
Absolutely.
And I cease to acknowledge you because I forget that you contributed to my knowledge.
That's right.
It becomes my own knowledge with which I work.
Yeah.
That is possible when power dimension is diluted, let me put it like that.
That's right.
Then the knowledge, the good teacher does that most of the time, that so that it becomes your knowledge.
It is also your concern
It
always
puts the knowledge into experimental and
right.
experiential frame. And when it is realized in experiential frame, it becomes your knowledge.
Absolutely.
And therefore here, I mean, one last point about power is not enough. I think it's the authority of knowledge.
The authority of knowledge.
Now, it should not be on power.
To be based on?
It should be based on knowledge, if you like, and should be based on what you may call equality of souls, equality of this thing.
Cooperation, solidarity.
But knowledge is own authority also, that it validates itself in your living authenticity. I cannot preach one, I mean, the authenticity. It also resounds in a different way in their receptivity. Ability, something I was missing and you gave me. It's different thing that something you impose on me.
That's right.
So pedagogic processes are equally important as knowledge dissemination and all that. I mean,
that's right.
And that is democratization dimension I want to.
No, definitely. I think that if the knowledge, when you say authority based on knowledge itself, is probably, in my view, the fact that knowledge, because becomes my own knowledge and therefore for my own purposes. That is to say, knowledge is always a useful instrument. People, use knowledge every day to do their things, do their cooking, to go around and so on. So we need knowledge everywhere and every time. And in a sense, what we have in the different kinds of knowledges are reproduced in different kinds of practices. So you consider a very important practice, the high technological practice, the mobile phones, technologies, going to the moon is, some practices that we, value very highly. Why we don't value very highly the everyday practices of people that struggle for life, for their food, to
and
take
they have
care of
also theorized their knowledge at their own level.
At their own level. Yeah, that's right.
In their own way.
That's
I would rather say level.
That's right.
But in their own way, they have done that.
Yeah. And that's my question about Gopal's epistemology. The Dalit epistemology is probably not a pure epistemology in the sense that purely Dalit. It is absorbing elements from non-Dalit experience, from Western scientific knowledges, and make more hybrid type of knowledge elements.
Yeah,
probably purity is something that we'll talk about purity later on castes. But I think that the knowledge is itself.
Purity is unreal.
Yeah, it is unreal. It's absolutely.
The second thing is pure except what you may think what is pure.
Yeah, but the second complication, Dhirubhai, is that once you unpack this subaltern element or this exclude, discriminated against, then you discover other discriminations inside the group. That is to say, for instance, Dalit Muslims, Dalit and classes, because there are Dalits that belong to the new middle class, and there are Dalits that are down there. So, can we talk about Dalit epistemology or indigenous epistemology without unpacking the socio-economic differences that are emerging?
We can talk about oppressed. Culturally, socially, and structurally, also historically oppressed. Dalit is only an aspect of that. But oppressed is a reality of people, oppressed by knowledge systems, oppressed by power system, oppressed by economic structuring, and all simultaneously affecting different people. Dalit is an epitome of that. Dalit is a kind of what you may call a classical, anthropologist subject, in the sense that that can unpack so many other things for you if you understand Dalit.
That's right.
But if you particularize Dalit from other oppressed, then you have a problem. So,
because you see systems of oppression operating inside.
Because there are exactly. So that oppressed knowledge is a category which can create epistemology of its own. But there is no epistemology which is one's own. Once it is there, it travels, it interacts, it modifies, and it modifies the other. I think in this identity politics and statement, we have, and the diversity celebrations, we have forgotten the natural processes which were already there, where identity is dissolved, merged into a larger thing, not necessarily by subjugation, but by transactions of life.
But you see, it is true, but you know, when we look at Ambedkar's dialogue with Gandhi, right, about the caste issue.
Whose dialogue?
Ambedkar.
Yeah.
Well, it is clear that for Gandhi, the idea of being an Hindu, you know, encompasses everyone, and therefore we should not call for separation because we are separate from the colonizer, and digamos, the Indo culture, you know, combines everyone, and of course Ambedkar was not really very convinced by this argument.
Rightly so. Yeah.
Nor was he convinced by Nehru's argument, which is also another way of dissolving the nation, you know, nation building and so on, that dissolves also all these differences. So that even within India, we saw these tensions, and there is another one that I'd like you to comment on, is the tension between Tagore and Gandhi.
Yeah.
Because in a sense...
Oh, that's a field by itself.
No, it's because...
We'll go on till evening, but let's see.
No, it's just, because whatever I know of this debate, is this is relevant for us
today.
Relevant.
It's relevant.
Because in fact, Tagore was always, you know, claiming that you cannot really discard the West. The West should learn from the East, of course. He makes that point very, very often. But you cannot discard completely. And this debate with Gandhi was a bit more on this. Gandhi was more essentialist, you know, was seen as an essentialist from the East.
Gandhi did not discard West. Gandhi did not discard Western ideas. See, that's otherwise Gandhi will appear, in fact, Gandhi appears as half Christian in his theology. He talks of trusteeship, which is a central Christian theological idea about nature. He says that God, he doesn't use the word God even. When all work was done, humans were entrusted to preserve it. And that's the idea of trusteeship. So you see, this is what complex. But coming back to Ambedkar, which is very right, which is that, yes, and that is the diversity of experience also. There is not only diversity of cultures, but different experience and all that. My problem is exceptionalism. Dalits are very oppressed, but it cannot be cultivated into Dalit exceptionalism, which may not apply to, say, a Muslim Dalit, or may not apply even to a Brahmin family in Tamil Nadu. Imagine it, oppressed socially, culturally and economically, and wants to get away. So oppression should not be concretized, and theoretically should not be or could not be concretized and exceptionalized. In terms of policies, in terms of instant recognition for correction and help, of course that is important. For example, Ambedkar is absolutely right. Gandhi, really speaking, was not addressing his programs to Dalits. His agenda was to change the sensibilities and hearts and the criminality of untouchability from the upper caste. He was addressing his fellow caste class people and making them aware about their criminality of untouchability and all that. So his agenda were upper caste,
That's it.
basically, to address, to reform, and which he achieved. When it came to Dalit, I don't think Gandhi, Ambedkar was unavoidable, more than unavoidable. Gandhi could never have done what Ambedkar did for Dalits. But Ambedkar and no other, including Nehru, could have done anything for Dalit which Gandhi did by softening, questioning and erasing as far as possible that consciousness of oppressor, of people practicing untouchability. The kind of guilt is the first to declare that it's a criminal behavior. So Gandhi was addressing to these people, Ambedkar, the Dalit, and both, you see, and that's the dynamic. It's not one against the other, I suppose. That's the dynamic of transformation, that first comes the structural kind of a thing, and then the recovery comes through more inner principles and transformations, which Ambedkar made Dalit. So under Gandhi's framework, Dalits were treated as a paternalistic, well-meaning, but non-Dalits ruthlessly, uncompromisingly. Upper caste hated Gandhiji at a certain time more than they hated Ambedkar.
Really?
Yeah. I'm talking of the 40s, 50s, 60s when he wrote it. Later on it became different when Dalits started objecting to and even hating Gandhi, because nobody likes paternal kind of extension for all time. You want to come to your own. Even only your dear father also becomes a problem after a point, which happened to, and that is how it ought to be.
After all, there were different conceptions of the nation in these people.
Yeah, Ambedkar had more a liberal conception.
Really?
Yeah, it's more like Nehru's when it came to liberalism in the West and all that, the democratic, it was more liberal democratic vision. With a question mark, of course, that when all this is achieved, it won't be enough for Dalit. That also was there. See, these great people in their vision are not closed mind. They leave a window for future development. But when they are politically acting, they have to shut that window and act. See, so you leave the theoretical window open, but politically you cannot leave it open.
That's right.
I mean, that's how most of them, Gandhi did that, Ambedkar did that.
But then Ambedkar had this major role in writing the constitution of India.
Yeah, that's why, because, but you know, he was kept out of cabinet, Nehru's cabinet. It was Gandhi's insistence that Nehru had to take Ambedkar in his cabinet. Later on, I'm talking of cabinet, not constituent assembly. That's because we want to believe that social knowledge is social science. It can never be science.
It cannot be science. So that's the point. That's what I call the ecology of knowledge. That is to say, science is very important.
Yeah, very important.
But it's not
things.
the only knowledge. There are other knowledge that interact, and they should respect each other for the different purposes in life. And therefore, we should be discussing. In the end, at the bottom of epistemology is politics. That is to say, what do you want in society? What kind of society do you want to create and develop? This, in my view, should be probably the urge behind the knowledge processes, while in fact we have naturalized capitalist societies today, and all the knowledge I see with great concern what's going on at the universities, because I see everywhere an attack against the social sciences and humanities, very rarely.
But that's not from scientific point of view.
That's right.
Not from the other side.
That's right.
Which is where we are sort of vantaging.
Yeah, and that's the interesting thing, because on epistemological side, we see the weaknesses, the imperial impulses of the social sciences throughout the world. They are being recognized. People from the global south are taking over. More and more creative social political theories are emerging here in South Africa, in Brazil, in Ecuador, and Bolivia. All this at the same time. One could say, well, we are preparing for a better world for the social science because the conversation is really expanding. At that very moment, the neoliberal logic at university knowledge, it says we need useful knowledge, technological knowledge, social science are out.
Both the points are problematic. One, we need useful, practical, tomorrow, how it is going to, making tractor more popular or whatever it is. So that is too pragmatic anti-knowledge statement, if you like. That's one end. The other end, it's imperfect science. It's not perfectly scientific knowledge, social science.
That's right, that's what they say.
It should be more rigorous. It should be more predictive in its things rather than this thing. So both comes from what you call neoliberal, and it's more scientific and useful tomorrow.
Yeah.
All right.
And in fact, it's becoming more and more blatantly apparent that the usefulness is market usefulness.
Yeah.
It is useful because it's tradable, because we can, establish patents on basis of that knowledge. We can expand the markets of products, and this is transforming the university itself into a market, into a marketplace, and a business, and the corporations. In fact, I was told that probably the majority of the students in India, university students, are studying in private universities. There's this idea of the university as a business is expanding in India, right?
Yeah, it is, very much so. Very much so. In fact, new universities are coming up for that. How to make knowledge useful tomorrow and that sort of thing. But the problem is also, that knowledge, I lost it, I had it in mind, but it will come again.
The struggle for knowledge, and this relates to our previous side, that knowledge for itself is knowledge for a different society that does not reduce the aspirations of people to markets.
But why? That was I was saying. I think what we have not addressed enough is the kind of politics we require. We think also equally theoretically and ideationally about alternatives, about alternative practices. But I think we have to evolve, whoever we are. I think there is a large world there. A politics of it. How a political, and Gandhi was aware that without politics he cannot realize his vision. So, politics is an important dimension to change the system. And that kind of alternative politics, which one wants to hope something like AAP is doing, is without which we can only remain on the margins of being critics and commentators, but not the changers of any kind. So for that you require politics, I suppose, political practices.
That's a beautiful point to end this part of our conversation. We move on to politics now. So, Dhirubhai, I think that all these revolts that we are witnessing throughout the world, they really show a call for a different type of democracy. And what you were saying, which I think is, I would like you to pursue a little bit this line, is that we have a kind of a homogeneous idea of democracy that leaves out many democratic practices of the people. It's interesting because it resonates very well this concept that I've been putting forward of demodiversity. The need of democratizing democracy by including different forms of democracy. I'd like to that you could really pursue this line in India.
Let me try to democracy as it is and as it has developed, the liberal democracy. See, liberal democracy favors uniformity, political stability, and political uniformity of forms. And now a power, global power and military power has come into aid of spreading and imposing that kind of one kind of democracy everywhere. And this has diminished democracy. That's what I was trying to say.
Yeah.
And in India, it becomes worse because this global democracy, there was already economic and social hierarchical gaps. Now these gaps were multiple, not gaps but inequalities, small formation. Now inequalities have also sort of homogenized in its culture of poverty, in its culture of subservience, culture of subjugation, and a kind of so the social so there is a kind of a acute relative deprivation for large masses of people. And if you take statistics also, now more and more rich people enter legislatures. Even in 20 years it has changed. That from whatever class they may come, they make up if they are poor through massive corruption. But the basic divide is between rich. So the democratic rule is also by the rich now, more blatantly and more clearly than it was even say 2-3 decades ago in India. That doesn't mean that Dalits are not entering legislatures or tribals are not entering, women maybe are less but still, but these are categories which have become theoretical. The fact is the basic divide between rule and ruled is now shaped by economic divide, also cultural divide. Even so the people who represent Dalits or people who represent tribals and the tribals themselves, all this, the divide is social, cultural, economic and political, but mainly economic. Because once you go into politics, you become rich in not 2 generations, but in 2 terms that you serve in legislature. I mean, that is the, now we can find more acceptable theoretical terms to describe this very crude kind of a situation that has been created.
And
So,
are the rules being revolted? Are they revolting?
yeah, there
Because
are
of-
small revolts. No, of course, there are revolts, there are reactions. The entire civil society scene has energized through that. We had lots of grassroots movements. What Naipaul once said, million mutinies. These are little revolts, but they go only so far for that.
Why is that? Why these grassroots that you have analyzed so well in India, in our previous projects and
Yeah.
so on, why don't they, are more effective in changing the political
I
landscape?
think it will be seen retrospectively that grassroots were sort of movements were confined to civil society arena by and large. Then it became institutionalized as a permanent critics or a permanent noisemakers, however you call it, and they get little bit of thing. Now with the AAP party barging into the representative system, so movement is now right within the establishment. I don't know what will be the consequences. We'll talk about it.
Yeah.
But that is the latest that is happening to this thing. But the structural divide that democracy has created here is for 2 reasons. This is there empirically. That's why the issue is part empiric and part epistemic. The epistemic issue is very important in the sense that democracy came here more as a baggage of modernity and coloniality, with the result that democracy in India, I mean, so the ruling class of democracy also propounded a kind of ideology for democracy which has modernity at its core. The categories of modernity and all that.
Right.
So moment there is something like caste or a khap panchayat, I mean people have they do not want to wait and see what actually it is. Even the empirical science is gone. It is branded as feudal, oppressive, male-oriented, which may be. That's not the point. Point is this: there are similar formations earlier which have been transformed through democracy. This can also be, but now this is an epistemic divide.
But they
of the
started
rulers.
with democracy or they started with the colonial state? Because it is the colonial state that brings this idea that the colonial state in India is a rational entity,
Yeah.
while the society in India is traditional, is religious, and so on. This gap between the rationality...
Absolutely right, and I agree. Except that democracy, in fact, as in politics, it has come as a corrective and a kind of a counter process to colonial as well as traditional social oppressive structures, which modernity may not permit, which democracy finds spaces for that. I agree with you. But having said that, there is something more happening here because democracy is theoretically and on value based is informed like everywhere else in India now with a dogma called liberalism. See, liberalism, if it has not come through your normal processes of society, individualism and liberalism, and when it becomes a dogma, it becomes counterproductive for democracy. Freedoms people understand, equality people understand, but liberalism, which is a pure cultural dogma rather than political democratic dogma, because liberalism as an evolved theory, I am not talking of liberal attitudes that people may have. But it takes time. I mean, to bring the Western so-called changes and emancipation through liberal dogmatics.
But liberalism is what? Individualism then?
Individualism of the highest order. I mean, and that is, this is a very complex issue. I don't know whether we can do justice in conversations of a limited time, but the issue is that liberalism, the ideas, and more than ideas, the practices associated with liberalism are seen as alien.
In India?
In India, and I think it will be in most places, which we see it as a reaction of tradition. But I say it differently. I think the democratic aspiration of freedom is so universal that people do not want to stick unreasonably to old ways. So it's not about old ways versus new ways. It's more about their ways versus our ways. See, and so that requires a different democratic procedure to deal with that than condemning, ban the carbs. Carbs are terrible in some respect, but you can't ban. You have to sort of take into stride in the democratic transformative process. Otherwise you have to ban families because there are rapes in family, there are child ill treatment in families, child's best interests are not served in family. So many things happen. But what is the liberal dogma has one kind of solution, and what I differentiate from liberal to democratic, freedom-oriented would have a different kind of programmatic solutions. So that is the very fine distinction, but I think we need to make. That is liberalism an integral. I think liberalism is a Western developed idea which has become a dogma.
But the representative democracy, based on the idea that one man or one person, one vote, in fact subscribes to individualism.
It is, yeah. And that's why I say that there were, you may call it proto-democratic, because when it once get into tradition versus modernity, good old India with all the great heritage, I don't want to go into that.
Yeah.
That's why I'm not thinking, but democracies without the name, in terms of respecting certain kind of mutual freedoms, were practiced. There were also the other aspect of it, we saw in untouchability, oppression and all that. So the short point is that like modernity, now we realize in theory that there are different modernities. I think we ought to move towards the idea that there can be different democracies.
That's precise.
It cannot be one uniform, one size fit all solution for achieving freedoms.
And then that's precise.
But what this structure has done, it has given ample economic freedoms to reach.
You know, and I think that when you say the liberalism, and you may be right, but I think that the idea of focusing on just one form of democracy, which is the liberal democracy, representative democracy, without, for instance, the social redistribution content, which was the basis of social democracy in Europe, for instance. This idea was brought about by neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is not the opposite of liberalism, but it's very different. Because the liberal idea with the questions of freedom and at least the equal opportunities called for certain forms of equal opportunity and so on, while neoliberalism discards everything whenever it discards public education, public health, and so on. So even the canon or the dogma of liberal democracy has been impoverished through globalization. Don't you think so?
You're right, but let me put it a bit differently what we were talking, that this structure of democracy, now liberal is the right, what it does is the way in which it divides the rulers and the ruled. That is the problematic, basically. How to reduce that gap where rulers, while ruling, also live, behave, and partake and participate with others as if ruled. And ruled do the similar as if rulers kind of situation, so that this divide between people. See, the real problem is the category people, the way in which it is making rounds. So in India we have produced people, but we don't have citizens in true sense of the term, except voting. The kind of people living decent life as equal member of the state in many respects, so that except a functional role between rulers and ruled, they should appear much closer to each other at a higher level. You are a doctor, you may do doctorate, but you rule. But the rulers then, in the old mode or whatever, set themselves apart. Culturally also, economically in a big way, politically almost in a top-down hierarchical way. So this formation, I don't know whether it is liberal, neoliberal, but the fact is that structurally democracy has created this formation, and and that's why this Aam Aadmi idea, the fact that the people and all that it comes with it. So it's an irony that the kind of new divides and inequality that is created by structures which are called democratic need our attention in the sense that how to disseminate, how to disperse, in fact, these structures in one way or the other.
Well, you know, I think, of course, there are different conceptions of ruling, and the ones that you were mentioning resonate very well. For instance, the indigenous concept in Latin America or in the Americas, the indigenous conceptions of ruling. The concept is the ruling by obeying. That is to say, the ruler is there to serve the people, and that's why then in many of these communities they have democracy by rotation, because a ruler by the rotation. Why? Because it is a burden, it's a service. You rule because it is a service, it's your turn. It's not because you're privileged, it's your turn to serve the people. So a different kind of conceptions, and we'll come to that definitely. But even within...
But that was pre-democratic, this conception of rule.
Pre-democratic? What do you mean by that? Pre-modern democracy.
Pre-modern.
Because there were...
No, pre-modern, I'm sorry.
That's right. Because there are other forms, and that's why I'd like to to come into. There are two ways in which we can pursue this conversation. I want us to pursue both. One is how we renew these modern structures of democracy with other forms of democracy invented, new institutions, we will come to that. The other one is to reevaluate other forms of liberation, deliberation that you just called pre-Western modern type of democracy, but they existed in India, they exist everywhere. And of course, it's very easy to make the argument, and many, well, that was the modernity and the colonial argument, that all these structures were oppressive. Panchayats were oppressive, and so on. All these forces are a part of a, a past world of feudal prejudices and oppression of women and castes and so on. Fair enough. But we also have seen that sometimes even these old institutions have been entering in some dialogue, as we saw in our previous project, the idea of democratizing the panchayats in West Bengal, for instance. So the idea that you can take the old and to renew it with a new democratic imagination. So let's address first this idea. These forms that existed prior to the colonial period in such a rich and millennial type of cultures in India, do you think that these energies, this richness of forms of deliberation at the community level, are they being eroded at all? Could they be reinvented? After all, in rural areas, they are still very rich. Is just an area of oppression, or should we do away with them, or should we try to reinvent, to democratize them, bring in another imagination on them? What do you think of that?
I think that's a very difficult poser, if I want, but it seems to me that in India, there are habits, there are practices, there are lingering old philosophies, which is by and large a culture of dialogue, conversations, but not with a view to become similar, but to realize that what you have is good for you, but it's not good for me. What I have is good for me, may not be good for you. It is with that kind of recognition of differences, of not just way of life, but of perspective and of looking at things and doing things, that you recognize. That comes in religion also, in a way, that everybody is born in one's religion. Your religion is good for you, my religion is good for me. And I must respect that you live your religion and you better stay in your religion, just as I should better stay in my religion. Unless it becomes oppressive, then there will be an internal change and transformation, like Protestantism comes, some new sect arises, that takes away. So religion has their own dynamic. But why should state come in here and change it? Because see, and that is not democracy, that is modernity. I would say that I think modernity for democratic practices need to be neutralized, not be denied. I do not see modernity as a unmitigated evil or something. I think it's a force that nobody can escape. I mean, I personally believe that there is a force of the time. It could be globalization, it could be democracy, modernity. And force of the time, you cannot reverse. Whether you are a World Social Forum or whether you are a Naxalite, or there is a force of the time. But that force of the time needs to be tamed, trained, obviated, cheated, do other things, but that force prevails and transforms you. But your freedom is to resist, adapt, change, and then from T1 to T2, at least it seems that I won't say you have made peace with that force, but in that process of that dialectic, you have changed the nature of that force also. Now, this is a democratic way of looking at it.
Right.
And there is a modernist, ideological, dogmatic way of looking at it. That if you are not doing this, if you are a Khap Panchayat, I don't know how much you know about Khap Panchayat.
No, I don't.
Big news today. Because they are male-oriented, without doubt. They are seen to be involved in honor killings, do not like their girls of the community to marry outside the coded kind of thing, so many things. And it's an oppressive structure. But at the same time, it is the followers see it as also a protection for the ways they are doing. Now, Khap is, so there are two perspectives, democratic, transformative, which is to and regulate them by the law of the land.
Can you transform them from the inside?
And also, yes, you can. So many things have been transformed. Why it cannot be? The leadership changes can occur, but now it's black and white. But that's a modernist judgment. That's not a democratic process. That's what I'm trying to say. As they are really existing, are in need of fundamental transformation, but not in need of abolition. If they are abolished, they will abolish themselves, just as most caste aspects have been abolished. But there is a democratic perspective and there is a modernist perspective. They are seen to be aligned by elite, but they do not always align.
That's very interesting. This contrast, which I think is very, very important that you make between the impulse of modernity and the impulse of democracy.
Yeah.
It means that you are decoupling, uncoupling democracy from the modernity.
Yeah.
That is to say, we are calling for a non-Western imagination of democracy. That is to say, because modernity or a non-Western
I
modernity.
won't say non-Western. Recover your own, whatever is there. And then also confront Western and take good from that too.
Good.
I mean, there are lots of things. I cannot, see, in Western, because in the West, democracy has become, in a manner of speaking, with checks and balances and all that, respecting of certain kind of boundaries of power. Here they are not recognized so easily, because they are seen more in a communitarian terms than in role and functions terms. So there are so many things. But basic point, you are right, is that the logic of modernity and logic of democracy may align and may not align. But when they don't align, democracy becomes a power and a violence on the other democratic process. Modernity, through certain narrow conception of secularism and certain narrow conception of individualism. Individualism is a big problem. Individualism in West has grown through cultural processes, not through democratic processes. So here you have to think of group rights.
Of course, we'll come to that, because I think that's very important if we take that. But suppose that even still sticking to these non-Western, originally non-Western traditional forms of deliberation at the community level that you find throughout the world, and you find them very rich in India. And your point, and I agree with that, is not a question of abolishing them, but the question of transforming them so that they may perform useful functions and even contribute to enrich the democratic landscape and the possibilities of democracy.
Right.
But how do you do that? You do that from the inside, or do you do that by external regulation?
Let's see what Gandhi did. Gandhi did not accept a single tradition of India. And he rejected Indian village as much as Ambedkar did, but not in the same terms. Gandhi created his own village in the ashram. He criticized, when Mayo report came, he said every Indian should read it as a gutter inspector report. So he was a nationalist, but at the same time he redefined tradition and changed in that process rather than, so what he tried to do is to transform them from inside. sometimes giving different names and all that, but not performing an act of what you may call self-hatred.
But it was a village imagination. It was a village imagination, not a city imagination. So
yeah,
it
was a village imagination. I accept that. But question is, through that process, you may accept the features of urbanity, which will be different from urbanity, which you have not made your own, understood, comes over you, upon you, and you submit to it, and then you begin to live with it and live well. I don't know if it's living. I cannot stay in a village for a long time. Now I can, perhaps. I went to my village because there is electricity, there is this, there is little. So it's like that. The real life transformations come imperceptibly and naturally through this kind of process. So that's why I was talking of Gandhi. He restated tradition, but in that process changed the substance of it. In a matter of speaking.
You know, I think that Gandhi was a great intercultural translator because he was, you know, in fact, he was picking up from the West. He even said in some wrote in some texts that of all the Western traditions, he would probably prefer anarchism because of the questions of the distance vis-a-vis the state, because Gandhi was more hostile to the idea of the state, while the modernist Nehruvian type of conception was more focused on the state. This tension is still vivid today in India, state and non-state, Nehru versus Gandhi.
Nehru versus Gandhi is still there a little bit, but more on the themes like conversions and secularism and also decentralization. But Nehru was also for decentralization that way. I think the differences between Nehru and Gandhi are overly stated. Theoretically, I think it's a different issue altogether. I would not like to go into that because of distraction.
No,
not any other reason.
It's a free conversation.
Yeah, but main point is, I think that just theoretically, can't we sort of disentangle, separate out these two concepts instead of conflating them all the time, modernity and democracy.
Right.
That is it. Once you disentangle these two and remove conflation, then democracy would allow recovery of selves, if you like, in a different way, which can then adopt modernity in a more confident and a more useful way, you see.
Because ideally, democracy, in fact, would eliminate the divide between rulers and ruled. But on the contrary, the paradox is that it makes it very strong, and as you say. So let's pursue this, Dhirubhai. One of the ideas that have been discussed is that not one side, as I said, was can we reinvent all these non-modern, traditional, whatever modes of liberation? That's one side. The other side are even within the Western canon, if you like, there are other forms of democracy other than representative democracy. Let's take participatory democracy. Do you see a hope there for a new merging or a complementarity between representative democracy and participatory democracy, as is being proposed actually by UP at this point? So gradually we'll move into UP, but we'll do that right.
But because democracy by definition, according to me, has got to be participative. You cannot have non-participative democracy.
That's right.
It's the extent of the participation that is limited or opened up.
That's a good point.
So I think it should be seen as a process where the same structures can be opened up for greater participation and feedbacks and whatever that is required. Because people do not want to be 24 hours participants in ruling generally. So the other important aspect which people have explored is also trust. I think trust is important for participation I mean, if I have a trust in you, I will accept what you are doing for me. Even I said, I think this is a good shirt for you, it will suit you, I will at once wear it. Let me put it like that. That's not an imposition.
Of course.
So what is lost is trust, which is now for last 2-3 decades has been explored in Western social science. And previously, if you remember, trust was considered a kind of a, not a rational category.
That's right.
Trust was not a rational category.
Of course.
That is a new admission into democratic theory of a non-rational category like that. And there are many such things. Camaraderie, group feelings, mutuality of one kind or another. So many things are there. So that needs to be participated. Second, basic democracy is always local. Basic. So question is decision-making structure, not one replacing the other, where the vital decisions affecting people are taken at the level at which they are affecting people. Now, people here want to solve problem of hunger from Delhi. Problem of hunger is easy to solve if it is local democratic way it is done. Contribution and all that, so many such things. And that's why I think all these structures, the problem is of structures that we have put in place for democracy are too limited. No? And they are drawn more from the idea of, modernist idea of order, control, a kind of censor, I don't know. So bottom up and participative democracy is needs a lot of. One idea of participative democracy was it's an alternative structure. I don't think so. I think these democracies can be made more and more democratic and more participative through shifting the centers and diversifying centers of decision making in the governance. So that what is relevant at my level, I decide.
Yeah, one could see that.
I don't want to participate in foreign policy making. I do want to, but not in the direct sense.
Yeah.
Or defense and my. Ideally, I think these little democracies, participative, should make globally possible to eliminate nuclear weapons.
That's right. But see, you know, that's a further point now that probably for some people in the world, for you, for me, for many people, we were also trained into our political imagination on the divide between left and right.
Yeah.
And here you have up that, you know, very explicitly negates that. So they refuse to be labeled as left and as right. What does it tell us? I mean, this refusal, and apparently this is part of the success. To refuse, while we were created, or people throughout the world were created in modernity, so to say, into this divide that comes from the French Revolution, the left guys in the Constitutional Assembly, the others on the right. So this left and right has been part of our imagination. Can we think of politics, which side are you on, without relying on this divide, which, as App is saying, we are neither right nor left. And curiously enough, Dhirubhai, I see that as a symptom that is much broader than Indian, because almost at the same time, a movement in Italy was created, this five-star movement, and this five-star movement, which is now a party and a successful one, refuses also the division between left and right. How do you see it?
Yeah, because structurally also things have changed, no? I mean, look at the working class. Who is the working class today? In this post-technology kind of thing. I mean, if we look at left and right from its original meanings, then they have lost relevance of the kind they had once. Working class, but still there is capital, still there is capitalism, but that's a different capitalism which probably was confronted by Marx and Engels. And after global capitalism is still different, and capitalism will remain a problem. but it requires, but the old solutions won't work with that, this capitalism, which is global and all that. So left, I would consider AAP as a left movement, let me put it like, but not leftist. Left in the sense that radical, revolutionary potentials, something which transforms and changes when sometimes you don't know for what. See, actually when the event happens after 20 years, you can see it in a more systematic terms. But when it happens, we don't know what is happening.
Right.
But the fact is that anything which is radical, I don't like the term right radical. Radical is always left for me. I mean, so because that is how it changes. But this left has nothing to do with Marxist communist left.
That's right.
I mean, look, anybody who questions the establishment, I think for me Gandhi was the left. He was revolutionary. His terms were different, his methods were different, but he was the most anti-status quo person leader India had.
But I
he
may
did
be
not allow single thing.
But
as it was going,
yeah.
He would change it, different it.
But you can be also radical on the extreme right. You know, to
I would like to find another
status.
term, maybe it's my English, but that's not radical.
Extreme right is extreme right, for instance, fascists in Europe, neo-Nazis.
They want to restore the right, which is losing in a way, in a radical way.
See, they are looking backwards.
Backwards,
yeah.
Probably. I'm just playing with words, maybe I don't know our ideas.
No, but that's good, that's a good point.
Thing that,
keep the radical for the left.
How they keep radical for the left. And radical is left. That's not right radical, it's not radical. It's a anti-status quo restore. I mean, something who, it's a
moving forward also.
Yeah. Restrictive of freedoms, I don't know. I mean, right radical is contradiction in terms for me.
Yeah.
If you are right on that kind, socially, culturally, and want to restrict power, monopolize power, I think anything which is for asserting and achieving monopoly of power in society, that's I would consider as rightist.
Rightist, and therefore does not challenges the status quo.
And
so
that change is for restoring the previous status quo of one kind or other.
But then East left, the APA is left, but not leftist. What is the
I
distinction?
cannot write about this, but when talking, I think.
No, that's
maybe,
wonderful.
I
take it. But what is the difference between left and leftist?
Left and leftist is like difference between Marx and Marxists.
I see. But then, you know, yes, and Marx even at a given point in time said, I'm not a Marxist.
Because leftist, any Islamism gets fixed at a point. You see, even if it is, it's not it cannot easily renovate itself.
I know. It's wonderful. So we'll stop here.